The morning mist hung low over the jungle canopy, curling around the massive ferns and palms like the breath of some unseen predator. Every leaf, every droplet of dew seemed to vibrate with anticipation, though no one dared speak it aloud. The Japanese infantrymen of the 2nd Battalion, 228th Infantry Regiment, moved silently along the narrow, rutted paths carved from centuries of tropical growth. Their boots sank into the muddy undergrowth, each step a small protest against the humidity that clung to their skin and soaked their uniforms. The air was thick with the scent of rot and salt, reminders of the island's proximity to the ocean and the slow decay of fallen soldiers, both Japanese and American, scattered throughout the interior. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda wiped the sweat from his brow, glancing down the line at his men. They were lean, hardened by months of fighting along the Solomon Islands, yet the strain showed in their eyes. Supplies had become increasingly scarce. Ammunition was measured in precious ounces rather than plentiful boxes. Water was rationed, and the rations themselves were barely adequate to sustain the men in the heat that reached near unbearable levels by midday. They carried Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, the latter slightly heavier, both familiar companions on every patrol, every advance, every ambush. In practice, these weapons were reliable, but they were delicate, finicky in the oppressive humidity, and, against a determined enemy with superior firepower, nearly impotent. "The Americans will strike soon," whispered a young corporal beside Takeda, his voice barely rising above the hum of cicadas. "The P-38s have been flying overhead. They circle the jungle like hawks." Takeda's eyes followed the sound of the engines rising through the canopy. A distant drone that gradually became distinct, the twin Allison engines of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning cutting through the morning haze. The men paused, instinctively crouching beneath the foliage, watching as silver streaks appeared over the treetops. These aircraft were a new threat. Unlike the older Army fighters the Japanese occasionally encountered, the Lightnings were sleek, fast, and heavily armed. Each carried .50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, capable of tearing through thin armor, wood, and even lightly fortified positions. They were the first harbingers of a form of American warfare that would come to define the Pacific conflict, swift, precise, and overwhelming in firepower. Takeda said nothing. He had been trained to measure threat without panic, to weigh courage against caution. Still, as the P-38s disappeared toward the rising sun, he felt an unease that had begun to grow among his men over the past weeks. Rumors travelled along the front lines like wildfire. American gunners who could unleash a storm of bullets that no man could survive. Browning M1919 and the larger M2.50 caliber machine guns that could tear apart both men and material with seemingly unerring accuracy. For the first time, the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began to question what they had once believed about the Americans. That their weapons, though numerous, were clumsy and over-engineered, cumbersome in jungle fighting, and incapable of matching the agility of the Type 99, or even the reliable bolt-action rifles favoured by the Imperial Army. Yet reports from forward units told another story. Entire squads had been pinned down by the steady rattle of machine guns from American defensive positions atop ridges. Advancing columns had been shredded before reaching cover, and officers' repeated attempts to coordinate flanking manoeuvres were often thwarted by overlapping fields of fire from positions that seemed impervious to assault. Takeda checked the weight of his own Type 99, the polished barrel slick with a thin layer of oil, the bolt mechanism practiced and familiar from months of use. It was a fine weapon, a soldier's companion in the thick of jungle skirmishes, but against a weapon designed to sustain fire for minutes on end, against a gun that could be mounted on vehicles, planes, and fixed emplacements, it was increasingly clear that the familiar rhythms of combat would be insufficient. In the distance, the rattling cadence of American artillery and automatic fire occasionally punctuated the ambient drone of cicadas and bird calls, a reminder that the enemy had arrived, not just as a threat, but as an omnipresent force. Word had filtered down from other units. The Browning M2.50 caliber had been encountered at the periphery of Henderson Field, mounted on reinforced tripods, firing through the tree line with a speed and precision that left Japanese officers scrambling to adjust their attack plans. Men who had lived through years of conflict on China's northern front or in Malaya were whispering, almost reverently, of a weapon of the devil. Takeda's mind wandered to the soldiers of the 228th who had been sent on reconnaissance missions near the Lunga perimeter. They returned pale, their uniforms shredded, speaking of bullets that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Their light machine guns had failed to hold back the waves of American fire. Ammunition had been exhausted in minutes, their magazines torn empty by rounds that carried enough force to punch through steel plating on trucks and lightly armoured vehicles. These were not the weapons of a disorganized colonial force. These were precise, relentless, and, in the eyes of men unaccustomed to sustained automatic fire, almost supernatural. Yet, despite the mounting reports, the men of Takeda's battalion pressed onward. Discipline and loyalty demanded it. Each patrol, each advance, carried with it the weight of the Imperial Army's doctrine: honour above fear, courage above survival. Still, the hum of engines above and the distant rattle of machine guns served as a persistent reminder. The calm of the jungle was deceptive. The storm was coming. The Japanese soldiers could not yet know the full extent of the firepower they would face. They could not yet understand that the combination of American industrial capacity, engineering precision, and tactical innovation would redefine the nature of jungle warfare in the Pacific. To them, the P-38s and the Browning heavy machine guns were curiosities at first glance. Imposing, certainly, but manageable with discipline and courage. That perception, however, would soon be shattered by the relentless mechanical precision of American fire. Takeda paused, lifting his gaze toward the ridges that would soon host the front lines. The morning sun was breaking through the mist, illuminating a landscape that seemed, for the moment, peaceful. But the serenity was fragile, a veneer over the chaos that awaited. Somewhere beyond the tree line, men armed with weapons that would come to be known as the Devil's Guns were preparing, unaware that their arrival would transform fear into legend among the Japanese troops on Guadalcanal. In the humid, oppressive jungle, Lieutenant Takeda and his men waited. The air was thick, the earth damp beneath their boots, the sweat stinging their eyes, but all that lay ahead was still invisible. The soldiers of the Imperial Army, relying on their trusted Type 96 and Type 99 machine guns, believed they were ready for the fight. They were not. The enemy, armed with firepower that seemed to defy human endurance, was about to awaken the devil in the trees. The morning haze had lifted, replaced by the oppressive glare of the Solomon sun. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda led his reconnaissance squad through a narrow jungle corridor that wound along the ridge overlooking the Lunga perimeter. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch set the men's nerves taut, but there was no turning back. Orders were explicit: determine the strength and positions of the American defences and report back to Battalion HQ. Takeda's men moved cautiously, their Type 96 light machine guns slung over their shoulders, bayonets sheathed but ready. Ammunition was sparse. Each soldier carried only what was absolutely necessary. Takeda himself carried a Type 99, its familiar weight a small comfort in the oppressive jungle heat. The soldiers were veterans, but experience could only go so far. They had yet to face the concentrated firepower of the Americans in Guadalcanal's rugged terrain. The first signs appeared near the tree line: distant flashes of gunfire, a low staccato hum that quickly escalated into a shrill, thunderous roar. Takeda froze, signalling his men to hit the ground. Through the canopy he saw them: American Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, mounted on improvised tripods, manned by young U.S. Marines who barely seemed aware of the lethal potential in their hands. The guns spat fire in controlled bursts, the metallic staccato cutting through the humid morning like a blade. The Japanese soldiers had heard rumours of these weapons, had even joked about them in the mess tent, but no words could capture the effect of facing them in combat. The first encounter was brief, but unforgettable. Corporal Sato, advancing ahead to reconnoitre a bend in the ridge, froze as tracer rounds tore through the undergrowth, shattering palms and spraying dirt across the path. His Type 96 jammed under the humidity, the bolt seizing at the worst possible moment. In seconds he was pinned, shouting for cover as the M2's relentless fire shredded the foliage around him. Takeda reacted instinctively, signalling his men to flank, to find a less exposed route, but the American gunners had already anticipated such manoeuvres. Each burst seemed calculated, precise, a river of bullets flowing impossibly fast, impossible to dodge, impossible to suppress. Takeda felt a surge of disbelief. He had seen combat in China, in New Guinea, even against Australian patrols. But this was different. The Americans were not just shooting at movement. They were shaping the battlefield with fire, dictating where Japanese soldiers could and could not move. The Type 96 and Type 99, reliable in smaller skirmishes, were now virtually useless against the overlapping arcs of .50 caliber bullets. Even when they attempted to return fire, their rounds were absorbed by the reinforced positions or simply fell harmlessly short. A lull came, brief as a heartbeat. Takeda crawled forward, assessing the aftermath. Trees bore fresh wounds from .50 caliber impacts, their bark ripped and splintered. Small craters pocked the mud, and the jungle floor was scarred by the impact of spent ammunition. Sato, shaken but alive, dragged himself back to the squad, pale-faced and trembling. It is no ordinary weapon," he whispered, voice cracking. "It is the devil's gun. No man can stand against it." This initial shock rippled through the 2nd Battalion over the next days. Patrol reports painted a consistent picture. US heavy machine guns were everywhere, mounted on ridges, hidden in dense foliage, sometimes even on trucks and light armoured vehicles. The .50 caliber rounds tore through sandbags, light timber, and even thin steel plating with ease. Japanese soldiers began to speak of them in hushed tones, comparing the weapons to a supernatural force, one that could see and strike without warning. Lieutenant Takeda convened a brief field meeting beneath the thick canopy, speaking in low tones to the men who had survived the first brush. "We must adapt," he said, though even his voice betrayed a hint of fear. "The enemy has weapons unlike any we have faced. We cannot charge blindly. We must move with caution, strike only where their guns cannot reach." The men nodded, but in their eyes lay the seed of dread. This was no longer just a question of courage or discipline. Survival itself was uncertain against firepower so absolute. Encounters with American heavy machine guns multiplied. One patrol moving along the Tanaru River reported being ambushed on both banks simultaneously. They had advanced under cover of dense undergrowth, only to be met by overlapping fire from twin M1919 and a tripod-mounted M2 on the riverbank. Men fell instantly, the sound of impact echoing through the narrow corridor. Takeda's own squad, hiding behind a large kapok tree, watched in silent horror as men from other units attempted flanking maneuvers, only to be cut down with methodical precision. The Americans themselves seemed almost indifferent to the chaos they wrought. In post-war testimonies, veterans of the 339th Fighter Squadron and Marine machine gun crews recalled the surreal calm of these engagements. To them, the Japanese soldiers were simply advancing targets, their courage notable but irrelevant in the face of technology and preparation. The fire discipline enforced by American officers amplified the effect. They were trained to maximize the lethal efficiency of every burst. Japanese soldiers, meanwhile, began improvising. Patrols moved only at dawn or dusk, when shadows and foliage could provide some concealment. They dug deeper foxholes, reinforced shelters, and even attempted rudimentary counterfire positions, hoping that concentrated bursts of their Type 96 seconds might suppress a single enemy gun long enough for an assault. But experience quickly taught them the futility. The American heavy machine guns were designed for sustained fire, their barrels cooling systems allowing near-continuous operation. No Japanese light machine gun could match the tempo nor the kinetic energy of the .50 caliber rounds. After each encounter, the same word spread quietly among survivors. Akuma no Ju, the devil's gun. It was a term born from terror and respect. This was not merely a weapon, it was a force that reshaped the battlefield, one that instilled fear before engagement, one that punished any misstep with immediate, often fatal consequences. It became a legend, whispered in jungle bivouacs, scribbled into patrol reports, repeated in letters home. By mid-November, Takeda's battalion had suffered significant attrition. Reports from other units confirmed similar experiences. Wherever American heavy machine guns were present, Japanese advances stalled or ended in disaster. Commanders recognized the pattern. Frontal assaults were suicidal. Attempts to bypass these positions required ingenuity and risk beyond what many units were prepared for. The Devil's Gun had not only killed men, it had disrupted strategy, reshaped tactics, and carved itself into the collective psyche of the Imperial Army on Guadalcanal. As night fell over the jungle, Takeda crouched near the ridge's edge, listening to the faint crackle of American fire in the distance. The stars above seemed indifferent to the suffering below, and yet each flash of tracer fire illuminated a harsh truth. The weapons of the United States had arrived in force, and the Japanese soldiers' familiar rules of engagement no longer applied. He traced the path of bullets through the dark canopy with his eyes, counting the arcs, imagining the devastating impact had he been on the receiving end. He felt a mix of awe and fear, a realization that history itself would remember these moments. "We face a weapon of the devil," he murmured, echoing the whispered phrase that had begun to haunt every patrol. "And we must learn to survive, or we perish." The dawn was thick with fog, the kind that clung to every branch and leaf, muffling footsteps and whispers alike. Lieutenant Hiroshi Takeda's squad had been ordered to probe American positions near the Tenaru River, where intelligence suggested the U.S. Marines had reinforced their lines with heavy weapons. The previous week's patrols had returned with grim tales, men pinned, flanked, or annihilated under the relentless fire of Browning M2s and M1919s. Takeda's stomach churned as he checked his squad, counting each Type 96 and Type 99, mentally noting each man's fatigue. He knew that this patrol was different. Command had stressed the importance of reconnaissance. Failure could mean disaster for the entire battalion. Yet even as they approached the river's edge, the familiar whispers circulated among the men. Akuma no Ju, the devil's gun. The first sight of it was surreal. Across the narrow waterway, perched atop a slight rise and partially concealed by foliage, were two American Browning M2s on tripods, flanked by 4 M1919 gunners. Each weapon gleamed dully in the diffuse sunlight, barrels long and menacing, tripods sturdy and immovable. The gunners were calm, almost bored, chatting in clipped voices that carried across the mist. To Takeda they seemed less men than embodiments of the weapon itself. He signalled his men to halt, crouching low behind a clump of ferns. The riverbank was open, the mud sucking at their boots, offering little cover. Takeda's pulse quickened as he calculated the odds. His men's Type 96 could reach only halfway across the river, and their rounds lacked the power to penetrate sandbags or light timber. Every fibre of his being screamed for withdrawal, yet orders left no room for hesitation. The first shot rang out without warning. The M2 barked, a thunderclap that shattered the morning calm. Mud and water erupted around Corporal Sato, who had taken the lead. His Type 96 rattled uselessly as he fired blindly, the recoil slight, the damage negligible. One by one, bursts of .50 caliber rounds tore through the undergrowth, ripping limbs from the earth and sending men sprawling. Takeda saw Private Nakamura thrown sideways by a ricochet, his face covered in mud and blood. The Japanese soldiers tried to respond. Takeda directed suppressive fire, but it was futile. The M1919S and M2s were relentless, their rounds too fast, too numerous, too powerful. Attempts to flank were met with precise bursts that cut the jungle paths as if by a scythe. For every tree or log they tried to use as cover, the Americans had already accounted, the guns' arcs sweeping the area with uncanny accuracy. In the chaos, Takeda realized something extraordinary about the American weapons. They were not merely guns, they were psychological engines. The continuous staccato of the M2, punctuated by tracer rounds, created a sense of omnipresence. The Japanese soldiers reported after the engagement that bullets seemed to come from everywhere, that even when hiding behind solid logs, they felt the air itself cut by invisible edges. Sato, still shaking, would later describe it as though the guns had a mind, anticipating movement and punishing hesitation. The first casualties fell quickly. Men who tried to advance or even peek over the muddy embankment were shredded before they could react. Takeda's Type 99 jammed under the heat and humidity, forcing him to switch to a sidearm, a pistol barely adequate against distant targets. Even so, he continued to direct his squad, barking orders to keep low, to move carefully, to avoid exposing themselves. A lull in the firing allowed Takeda to assess the damage. Half his squad had been hit. Blood pooled in the mud, leaves and branches splattered with gore. One of the men whispered, voice trembling, "We cannot beat it. No weapon we have can touch it." Takeda knew he could not argue. The truth was painfully clear. The American heavy machine guns had arrived not as infantry support, but as battlefield dominators. Desperate, Takeda ordered a flanking maneuver. Using fallen logs and the cover of dense ferns, a small detachment attempted to creep along the river's edge to reach the left flank of the American guns. The movement was slow, painstaking, each man calculating every step to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. But the M2 had already detected them. A single burst cut down Private Yamaguchi mid-step, the force throwing him into the water with a sickening splash. The men froze, watching their comrade dragged under, a haunting tableau etched into their memories. It was during this engagement that the term "devil's gun" solidified. Witnesses later recalled that the M2's roar seemed almost sentient, a voice demanding obedience through fear. The Japanese soldiers began attributing human characteristics to the weapons, anticipating, punishing, and delivering death with precise intent. Field diaries described the metal demon, the machine spirit, the devil itself, phrases repeated and whispered among survivors as both explanation and exorcism. Eventually, Takeda ordered a retreat. Survival was paramount. The squad crawled back through mud and undergrowth, leaving the riverbank littered with casualties. The Americans barely pursued, their machine guns now silent except for the occasional mechanical click. Takeda's men emerged exhausted, battered and psychologically scarred. For many, it was the first encounter with true, overwhelming firepower, a force that would forever shape their understanding of modern warfare. Post-engagement reports compiled by Battalion Command echoed the same lesson. Attempts to confront American heavy machine guns head-on were tantamount to suicide. The Japanese soldiers were forced to innovate. Night raids, infiltration tactics, and coordinated artillery suppression became necessary to survive. Yet even then, the memory of the M2's relentless bark haunted every patrol, every reconnaissance, every engagement. By late November, the Devil's Gun had become more than a nickname. It was doctrine. Officers emphasized caution, men whispered warnings, and reconnaissance reports highlighted positions not to be approached directly. The psychological impact of these weapons, so easily overlooked by initial intelligence, rivaled their physical lethality. Guadalcanal was not just a battlefield, it was a proving ground for the limits of Japanese tactical adaptation in the face of overwhelming American industrial and technological superiority. Takeda, sitting in a makeshift bivouac that night, wrote in his notebook, "Today we faced not a man, nor even a squad, but a force of iron and lead. The Americans' guns are beyond comprehension. We called them Akuma no Ju, and the name is fitting. Survive today, and you carry the memory of the devil with you. Fail, and there is only silence." The night echoed with distant gunfire and the hum of insects. Takeda's men lay awake, haunted not just by fallen comrades, but by the awareness that the battlefield had fundamentally changed. The devil's gun was no longer a rumour, no longer a whispered fear. It was a tangible, terrifying reality, an elemental force of death, indiscriminate yet precise, unforgiving yet inevitable. The first shock of encountering the Browning M2.50 caliber had settled into a grim realization. Frontal assaults were no longer viable. Japanese soldiers who survived patrols along the Tenaru River carried with them a new understanding. These weapons were not merely heavy, they were instruments of absolute control. Lieutenant Takeda, now reassigned to oversee a section of the 2nd Battalion's reconnaissance efforts, gathered his surviving men under the canopy of a rain-soaked jungle. "We cannot face it as before," he said, voice low but firm. "Every step forward will cost lives if we ignore its presence. The Americans' guns are like the ocean tide, inevitable, unrelenting. We must learn to move in shadows." Adapting meant first acknowledging limitations. Standard-issue Type 96 light machine guns, though reliable in short-range jungle engagements, had insufficient range to counter the American heavy weapons. Type 99 rifles could not penetrate sandbags or steel-reinforced positions. Mortars offered some counter, but supply shortages and ammunition limitations rendered them inadequate for continuous suppression. The M2, firing at 450 to 600 rounds per minute with .50 caliber bullets capable of shredding trees, vehicles, and men alike, had made all these weapons almost irrelevant in direct combat. The battalion command initiated field experiments. Patrols observed American firing patterns, noting the time it took for gunners to adjust targets, the angles covered by each tripod, and the distances at which suppressive fire was effective. Takeda recorded each observation meticulously in his field notebook, recognizing that information, not courage alone, would determine survival. By mid-December, new tactics emerged. Night movements became standard, with soldiers crawling along riverbanks or through dense jungle to avoid daylight observation. Infiltration teams were limited to small units of 2 or 3, carrying only essential supplies. Takeda's men learned to move silently, flattening grass, pressing against mud, avoiding snapping twigs. The jungle itself became both shield and weapon. Camouflage was adapted. Leafy branches were tied to uniforms, mud smeared on helmets, and foliage stacked strategically over dugouts. Even then, the Americans' M2s had long reach, and occasional bursts could kill or maim at hundreds of meters. Survivors recalled that the gun's impact was not limited to fatalities. The psychological effect of tracers arcing through the jungle at night created an impression of omnipresence. Troops reported that the sound of the weapon alone, even without a direct hit, could stop men in their tracks, freeze movement, and erode morale. Artillery suppression was attempted, but logistical constraints in Guadalcanal limited its availability. Units improvised with captured explosives or incendiary devices, but each attempt highlighted the stark imbalance. The Americans' industrial capacity allowed them to replace both guns and ammunition almost immediately. Each failed suppression reinforced the perception. These were not mere weapons, they were embodiments of an overwhelming technological advantage. Despite these limitations, adaptation continued. Takeda led a small group of men on a night raid targeting an exposed Browning M1919 position. Using hand signals and a coordinated approach, they avoided the direct line of fire, approaching from the river's dense undergrowth. The plan was simple: set timed incendiary charges, withdraw, and observe the impact. The raid succeeded in partially disabling one gun temporarily, but at the cost of 2 men wounded. Takeda noted the bitter irony. Victory against the Devil's gun was possible, but always fleeting. Each engagement demanded careful planning, discipline, and above all, luck. Even one misstep could transform the Devil into an executioner. The lessons learned in Guadalcanal spread quickly. Field officers circulated manuals and sketches of effective concealment, patrol rotation, and avoidance tactics. Veteran soldiers instructed newcomers: never advance without reconnaissance, never expose more than a single body at a time, always anticipate a second or third gun concealed nearby. Japanese diaries, post-war interviews, and battalion reports emphasized the same refrain. These weapons were not simply a threat, they were a teacher of humility and caution. The term Akuma no Ju became embedded in the unit's culture. Soldiers whispered it during patrol briefings, in the heat of engagement, and at night in bivouacs. It was simultaneously a warning and a talisman, a name for the fear they had faced and survived. Commanders documented it in after-action reports, noting that psychological effects, including paralysis, hesitation, and a decline in morale, were as significant as physical casualties. By early 1943, Guadalcanal was no longer just a test of strength, but a battlefield of adaptation. Japanese soldiers learned to respect the American heavy machine guns, understanding that technological superiority demanded tactical ingenuity. The Devil was real, but it was not invincible, only overwhelming. Survival depended on patience, cunning, and reverence for the destructive force that had earned its terrifying name. Takeda, writing in the margins of his field notebook, summarized the lesson succinctly. The enemy's gun does not merely kill. It teaches. It punishes arrogance. It rewards caution. To face it unprepared is to invite death. To face it wisely is to endure, if not triumph. Night fell over the jungle once more. The hum of insects mingled with distant gunfire, and the occasional bark of the M2, still visible from observation posts, still reminding all who survived that the Devil's gun was ever present. Soldiers huddled in their foxholes, listening, learning, and preparing for the engagements that would come with the sunrise. A new day in a war where the Devil walked beside every patrol. By early 1943, the Japanese infantry understood that no patrol could be routine. Every movement, every step into the open, risked encountering the M2.50 caliber or the Browning M1919. Soldiers nicknamed these guns Akuma no Ju, the Devil's weapon, not out of superstition, but from hard-earned respect for their lethality. Reconnaissance teams were now meticulously briefed. Lieutenant Takeda emphasized pattern recognition. American gunners rotated positions to cover overlapping fields of fire, often employing the jungle itself as a camouflage advantage. Even a moment's exposure, a leg stepping over a root, a rustle in the undergrowth, could be fatal. Reports from previous skirmishes documented how bursts of tracer fire could cut through dozens of meters of dense vegetation, leaving survivors shell-shocked. Night patrols became the standard. Small teams of 2 or 3 moved in complete silence, guided by hand signals and whispered commands. Each patrol required careful observation before advancing. When approaching ridges or riverbanks, soldiers waited for the slightest change in wind, the glint of metal, or the faint echo of a spent cartridge. The Devil's weapon did not always fire first. Its presence alone dictated the pace of movement. The psychological toll was severe. Veteran soldiers noted that even after escaping unscathed, men often hesitated in subsequent missions, their confidence eroded by the memory of sudden, devastating fire. Diaries and post-war interviews confirmed the trend. Japanese troops described the guns as if alive, a malevolent intelligence anticipating every move. Commanders incorporated these observations into tactical adjustments, recognizing that fear was as potent a weapon as the M2 itself. Field engineers experimented with rudimentary cover, logs, hastily dug foxholes, and dense foliage, but these measures only offered partial protection. Each encounter reinforced the lesson. American heavy machine guns combined range, rate of fire, and destructive force in ways Japanese small arms could not counter. Only speed, stealth, and terrain mastery provided a chance of survival. Despite the fear, adaptability became the defining trait of the battalion. Soldiers learned to approach enemy positions obliquely, to split into multiple flanking units, and to retreat before American gunners could concentrate fire. Casualties remained high, but each engagement added to a collective knowledge base that would later be codified in manuals and post-war analyses. Even as the campaign wore on, the devil remained unpredictable. Patrols that had succeeded yesterday could fail today. Supply lines, already strained, limited the ability to sustain extended operations. The heavy guns demanded respect, not only for their physical power, but for the way they reshaped the Japanese soldiers' approach to warfare. Survival depended less on bravery and more on discipline, observation, and a grudging reverence for the lethal instruments arrayed against them. By the second month of 1943, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal began to realize that the devil's weapon was more than just a gun. It was an omnipresent force, a shadow that defined the rhythm of combat. In the early days, patrols had moved with a mixture of confidence and bravado. They had underestimated the Americans' use of Browning M1919 and M2.50 caliber heavy machine guns, believing that their own Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns could compensate in a fight. That illusion had long since shattered. Reports from skirmishes, compiled by company clerks and shared between regiments, told a harrowing story. Entire squads had been cut down before they could react, sometimes without even glimpsing the gunners responsible. One such report, dated January 27, 1943, described a patrol of 12 men caught in an ambush near the Ilu River. Japanese soldiers emerged from the undergrowth only to face a hail of .50 caliber rounds. In less than a minute, 7 were dead, 3 wounded, and 2 missing. Survivors later recounted the weapon's sound, a deep, rolling staccato that seemed to shake the very earth, and the green traces that illuminated the jungle like sinister fireflies. The psychological impact was profound. Soldiers spoke of Akuma no Ju not as a tool, but as a living presence. Letters sent home from Guadalcanal detailed a growing dread of the machine gun nest. Even officers admitted that morale suffered not just from casualties, but from the inevitability of the threat. Japanese commanders began to adapt, revising orders to emphasize stealth, reconnaissance, and the use of natural cover. Patrols became shorter, movements slower, and reliance on signals and scouts more pronounced. Every operation had to account for the devil's shadow. The Americans, for their part, understood the strategic value of these weapons. Browning M1919 provided sustained suppressive fire, allowing infantry to maneuver, while M2.50 caliber machine guns could destroy light fortifications, vehicles, and even aircraft attempting low passes over the jungle canopy. Air support from P-38 Lightnings further amplified their effect. The synergy between air and ground fire created zones of near impenetrable danger for Japanese patrols, forcing them to constantly reconsider approach routes and objectives. Field adaptations by the Japanese included night-only raids and ambushes. Soldiers dug shallow trenches and erected makeshift bunkers, but these measures offered only partial protection. Japanese memoirs and post-war interrogation reports indicate that even well-prepared positions were vulnerable to the sheer volume and precision of American fire. Engineers experimented with angled firing ports and dispersed formations to minimize losses, but nothing could completely neutralize the psychological weight of the guns. The Devil's shadow extended beyond the battlefield. Supply lines were particularly vulnerable. Convoys moving along narrow jungle paths were prime targets for American gunners and their spotters. A single well-placed .50 caliber burst could destroy a truck, scatter mules, and disrupt an entire supply chain. These attacks forced Japanese logisticians to adopt nocturnal travel, extreme camouflage, and tighter patrol coordination. Every step became a calculated risk, every movement potentially fatal. Commanders also observed that the heavy machine guns affected unit cohesion. Younger soldiers, inexperienced and already unnerved by tropical disease, struggled under the constant threat. Experienced NCOs attempted to instill discipline and maintain morale, but even seasoned troops admitted that the fear of the Devil's weapon lingered long after an engagement ended. Some men, according to diaries and interviews from the 1985 Pacific Theatre Veterans Reunion, would refuse to advance without a seasoned guide or a diversionary tactic. The guns had redefined initiative. Bold action became secondary to caution, and hesitation could mean survival. Interestingly, exposure to these weapons fostered an evolution in Japanese tactics. Flanking maneuvers, previously a rare maneuver due to terrain constraints, became essential. Soldiers learned to divide into small teams to probe enemy positions, use indirect fire when possible, and coordinate attacks across multiple fronts to dilute American firepower. Communication became vital. Runners, signal flags, and pre-arranged sound codes allowed units to respond quickly to machine gun nests. Even then, success was never guaranteed. The Devil could strike from concealed positions, from ridges or across rivers, always unpredictable, always deadly. By mid-February, anecdotal evidence from Japanese war diaries suggested that soldiers had developed a grudging respect for their adversaries' ingenuity. The combination of terrain knowledge, heavy machine gun deployment, and aerial support created a force multiplier that rendered traditional frontal assaults nearly suicidal. Commanders began to document these lessons systematically, ensuring that subsequent deployments incorporated strategies for evasion, concealment, and indirect engagement. Akuma no Ju had not only reshaped tactical doctrine, it had rewritten the Japanese approach to jungle warfare entirely. Casualties continued to mount, yet soldiers adapted. Patrols became ghost-like, moving silently, with careful observation dictating every step. Discipline became as critical as courage. Hesitation could mean death, yet reckless action was equally fatal. The jungle itself became a partner in survival, with knowledge of ridgelines, foliage density, and river crossings providing marginal advantages. Even so, no measure could fully negate the presence of the Devil's weapon. In the minds of the Japanese soldiers, the M1919 and M2 had transcended their physical existence. They were symbols of the Americans' technological and tactical supremacy in the Pacific. They inspired fear, demanded respect, and forced a reconsideration of what was possible in combat. As the Guadalcanal campaign progressed, every engagement reinforced a singular truth. Survival depended not merely on skill or courage, but on the to anticipate and adapt to a weapon that seemed almost supernatural in its effect. By the end of February 1943, the Devil's shadow loomed over Guadalcanal. It was invisible yet tangible, a constant presence in every patrol report, every casualty list, every whispered conversation around the campfire. The Japanese soldiers had learned to live in its shadow, but none could forget it. The M2.50 caliber and Browning M1919 were no longer just weapons. They were arbiters of life and death, shaping the tactics, psychology, and very existence of those who faced them. March 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle taught lessons in the harshest ways. By March 1943, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal had been forced into a grudging school of survival, where the instructor was the Devil's weapon, the American Browning M1919 and M2.50 caliber machine guns. Every patrol, every supply run, and every frontal assault reminded them that underestimating these weapons could be fatal. Yet, from these deadly encounters emerged a grudging respect and a slow adaptation, an evolution in jungle warfare dictated not by doctrine alone, but by experience, blood, and the indelible shadow of American firepower. Company logs from the 2nd Infantry Regiment reveal a shift in operational philosophy. Officers, once confident in aggressive manoeuvres, now emphasized reconnaissance, careful observation, and patient movement. Patrols would advance in staggered formations, maintaining wide spacing to reduce vulnerability to bursts of machine gun fire. Scouts were sent ahead to probe for positions, sometimes going for hours without engaging the enemy, returning with vital information on the location and orientation of American nests. The lessons were simple but critical. The devil's weapon demanded caution, precision, and above all, respect. Field manuals and combat notes from this period illustrate the changes in Japanese tactics. The traditional light machine gun teams, which had operated in predictable patterns, were reorganized into smaller, more mobile units. Soldiers were trained to identify signs of M1919 and M2 emplacements, the faint impressions in mud where bipods had rested, the glint of metal in the undergrowth, or the irregular pattern of discarded shell casings. Any misstep, any lack of vigilance could mean instant death. Japanese engineers also became more creative. Trenches and foxholes were dug with multiple firing angles, giving defenders some chance to return fire without exposing themselves fully. Camouflage techniques evolved, utilizing the natural jungle foliage to hide the smallest movement. Even supply caches were dispersed across multiple concealed locations, making them less vulnerable to the concentrated firepower of the M2s and M1919s. Diaries and post-war interviews indicate that these adaptations were not theoretical. They were born of necessity, often after bitter experience. One particular engagement in mid-March illustrates the practical application of these lessons. A platoon of 30 Japanese soldiers had planned a raid on an American supply position near the Tenaru River. Previously, such an attack would have relied on the speed and shock of surprise. Now the approach was painstaking. Scouts surveyed the area for hours, identifying machine gun nests, lines of fire, and possible fallback routes. Engineers prepared improvised shields and dug concealed firing positions along the anticipated approach. Even so, when American gunners opened fire with their heavy machine guns, the platoon lost 5 men within seconds. But unlike previous encounters, the remainder managed to take cover, withdraw strategically, and return fire from concealed positions. The engagement ended in a stalemate rather than a massacre, a testament to the effectiveness of incremental adaptation. The psychological impact of learning to anticipate the devil's weapon was significant. Soldiers reported a mixture of fear and awe. Letters home described the guns not merely as instruments of war, but as extensions of American will, mechanical judges delivering swift sentences with terrifying precision. Veterans later reflected that surviving an encounter with an M2.50 caliber machine gun required a blend of courage, intuition, and a careful reading of the terrain. The guns had instilled a disciplined respect for firepower that reshaped Japanese infantry culture on Guadalcanal. Notably, these adaptations were not limited to individual soldiers. Company and battalion commanders began coordinating multi-pronged tactics to neutralize heavy machine gun positions. One approach involved feints and diversions, drawing fire to a decoy unit while the main body maneuvered to flank the nest. Smoke grenades and improvised incendiaries were occasionally employed to obscure lines of sight, giving attackers a chance to close the distance. In several cases, these tactics proved effective, allowing Japanese forces to seize or bypass positions that would have previously inflicted devastating casualties. Air reconnaissance, though limited compared to the Americans, also played a role. Small observation posts, often hidden in the canopy or atop ridgelines, would report enemy gun positions and troop movements. Coordination between these observers and ground forces enabled more precise planning, reducing the probability of ambushes by M1919 or M2 crews. Even so, luck remained a factor. The heavy machine guns could strike from unexpected angles, their devastating rate of fire unforgiving to even the most cautious soldiers. The Devil's weapon also influenced Japanese doctrine in broader strategic terms. Commanders recognized that frontal assaults against entrenched American positions were increasingly futile. Instead, they favored indirect approaches: infiltration under cover of darkness, diversionary attacks, and exploiting terrain advantages to avoid the concentrated zones of fire. These adaptations required patience and meticulous planning, emphasizing survival over aggression. It was an uncomfortable lesson for a military culture that had long valued offensive spirit and rapid maneuver, yet the effectiveness of the M2 and M1919 left no alternative. Moreover, the Devil's weapon became a benchmark against which other American capabilities were measured. Soldiers and officers alike noted the combination of firepower, accuracy, and psychological impact. Where light machine guns could harass or suppress, the M2 could annihilate. Where Japanese artillery required lengthy setup and coordination, heavy machine guns could be rapidly repositioned to cover key approaches. Combined with the P-38 Lightning air support, these guns created overlapping fields of control, forcing Japanese units to constantly adapt or suffer catastrophic losses. By the end of March 1943, Guadalcanal had become a crucible of adaptation and learning. The Devil's weapon had imposed new rules of engagement, reshaping Japanese tactics, training, and psychology. Soldiers had learned to move cautiously, observe meticulously, and coordinate relentlessly. They had developed techniques to minimize exposure, camouflage their positions, and exploit terrain. Yet the lesson remained sobering. The M1919 and M2 were not merely tools. They were arbiters of life and death, and respect for them was essential to survival. Even among the hardened veterans of the campaign, the guns inspired a mixture of fear, respect, and grudging admiration. Post-war interrogations and memoirs emphasize this duality. The American gunners, often faceless and distant, became symbols of lethal efficiency, while the weapons themselves, cold, relentless, mechanical, embodied the unyielding challenge of modern warfare. The Japanese soldiers of Guadalcanal had learned to live with the Devil's shadow, but they would never underestimate its reach or its power. In this crucible, the soldiers' understanding of the battlefield matured. Survival required more than courage. It required discipline, ingenuity, and humility in the face of superior firepower. The Devil's weapon had rewritten the rules, and learning to navigate its influence became the defining skill of those who remained alive. By April 1943, the Guadalcanal campaign had entered its final and most brutal phase. Japanese forces, weary from months of attrition, disease, and relentless combat, faced a reality shaped by the relentless presence of the American Devil's weapon, the M1919 Browning and M2.50 caliber machine guns. For the soldiers who remained, the guns were no longer novelties or mere tools of suppression. They were omnipresent arbiters of life and death, dictating every movement, every strategy, and every fleeting hope of success. Company logs and 13th Fighter Command debriefings from the period provide a detailed picture of this final phase. Japanese units had been whittled down, morale fractured, and supplies critically low. Previous frontal assaults had resulted in catastrophic losses, reinforcing the lessons learned over the preceding months. Every surviving officer understood that any direct engagement with entrenched American positions risked annihilation. The M1919S and M2s, often emplaced on ridgelines, riverbanks, or cleared patches of jungle, commanded fields of fire that left no room for error. Even a single misstep could result in immediate death. One particularly harrowing encounter occurred along the Ilu River. A Japanese platoon, tasked with reconnaissance and interdiction of American supply lines, approached under the cover of early morning fog. Scouts had reported faint glimmers of American metal, suggesting machine gun nests, but the exact location remained uncertain. As the platoon advanced, the first burst of M2 fire shattered the morning silence, sending splintered foliage and mud in every direction. 5 men fell instantly, their bodies pinned by the sheer kinetic force of the rounds. Others dove for cover, instinctively pressing into the shallow riverbanks and dense undergrowth. What followed was a tense and painstaking manoeuvre, a direct manifestation of lessons hard learned over the previous months. Using the river as partial cover and relying on hand signals rather than shouted commands, the platoon attempted to flank the nest. Smoke from a hastily improvised incendiary gave them temporary concealment, but the M2 gunners adapted quickly, adjusting their aim and maintaining a suppressive rate of fire. Over 30 minutes, the platoon suffered additional casualties, yet managed to force a temporary withdrawal of the gunners through a combination of feints and concentrated small arms fire. Post-action reports described this engagement as a textbook example of adaptation, a blend of careful observation, terrain exploitation, and disciplined movement in response to American firepower. Meanwhile, air operations added another layer of complexity. P-38 Lightnings, often flying at low altitude to provide close air support, further amplified the lethal reach of the heavy machine guns. The combination of air and ground fire created overlapping zones of control that left Japanese units vulnerable at nearly every angle. Combat diaries described the terror of advancing under this dual threat, bullets striking foliage, dirt and trees in unpredictable arcs, engines roaring overhead, shadows flickering across the undergrowth, and the constant reminder that exposure, even momentarily, could be fatal. Despite the heavy losses, Japanese forces were not completely defeated. Survivors adapted further, relying on decentralized command, meticulous scouting, and the timing of attacks to exploit even the slightest American oversight. Night operations became increasingly common, with small units infiltrating positions previously considered untouchable during daylight. Engineers improvised wire traps and natural camouflage to hide movements, and platoon leaders coordinated silent signals to maintain cohesion under the stress of imminent engagement. These adaptations reflected a grim calculus. The devil's weapon could not be outmatched in direct confrontation, only navigated, evaded, or outmaneuvered. Japanese soldiers' accounts, recorded during post-war interrogations, provide vivid insights into the psychological impact of these encounters. One former infantryman described the M2.50 caliber machine gun as a beast that sees everything, strikes without mercy, and allows no hesitation. Another recalled that the guns inspired both terror and a form of respect. Soldiers would deliberately avoid direct confrontation, yet simultaneously studied the gunner's routines, angles, and reloading patterns to identify exploitable weaknesses. The devil's weapon had become a constant presence in the soldier's consciousness, shaping decisions, limiting boldness, and instilling a cautious pragmatism that contrasted sharply with pre-campaign aggressiveness. By late April, the pattern of final engagements illustrated the full spectrum of adaptation. Units approaching American positions would often send decoys to draw fire, while the main force manoeuvred through concealed routes. Artillery and mortars, when available, were coordinated to suppress gun nests prior to infantry advances. Even then, the risk remained high. Casualty figures from these final actions underscore the lethality of American heavy machine guns. In a single week, several small-scale assaults resulted in losses of 20 to 30% of engaged troops, a rate consistent across multiple battalions. The campaign's conclusion left lasting impressions. Japanese officers reflected that the lessons of Guadalcanal went beyond the immediate tactical sphere. The encounter with American heavy machine guns represented a paradigm shift in understanding modern firepower. Traditional bravery and offensive spirit, while still valued, had to be tempered with discipline, observation, and the sober acknowledgement of mechanical superiority. The devil's weapon was not merely a tool, It was a teacher, ruthless and uncompromising, forcing adaptation and innovation in the midst of extreme adversity. Post-war analyses corroborate these first-hand accounts. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and the National World War II Museum's records confirm that the presence of M1919 and M2 machine guns on Guadalcanal significantly influenced Japanese operational choices, forcing dispersed formations, night movements, and avoidance of predictable routes. Japanese war diaries captured the recurring theme. The guns dictated the tempo and method of engagement, leaving little room for traditional frontal assaults. Commanders, aware of these realities, adjusted doctrine in real time, highlighting the interplay between lethal technology and adaptive human behavior in combat. Ultimately, the last encounters on Guadalcanal cemented the reputation of the American heavy machine guns in the eyes of Japanese soldiers. From initial skepticism to grudging respect, the evolution of perception mirrored the brutal reality of jungle warfare. Success depended not merely on numbers or courage, but on understanding, anticipating, and surviving the precise, unrelenting firepower of the devil's weapon. Letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies repeatedly mention a shared sentiment. These guns, and the men who operated them, were forces that could not be confronted lightly, yet their presence had taught a generation of soldiers invaluable lessons in discipline, adaptation, and the cost of underestimation.